You hold your hand up to the light, and you see a specific shade of skin. Most people assume this color is just genetics, but that pigment is actually a geographical map. It records an ancient and invisible biological negotiation between your ancestors and a remarkably harsh star. Every human alive today shares a single origin. Trace the evolutionary tree back into the past, and evidence indicates the entire early human population lived exclusively on the continent of ancient Africa. During this early period of deep human history, the founding population of our species almost certainly had a uniformly dark shade of skin pigmentation. To understand exactly why this was the case, we have to look at our outdoor environment. The sun constantly emits invisible ultraviolet solar radiation. Near the equator, this physical exposure is intense. The human skin naturally produces a protective pigment. Melanin acts as a highly effective physical barrier, safely scattering incoming ultraviolet light radiation away efficiently before it can deeply penetrate vulnerable underlying tissue. For decades, researchers assumed that cancer prevention was the primary reason for this deep evolutionary adaptation. High exposure damages cellular DNA over many years, which noticeably increases the likelihood of severe melanoma. But skin cancer typically develops later in life, often after a person has already successfully reproduced. Evolutionary selection is usually driven by specific traits that directly affect early survival and reproductive success. This brings us to a much more immediate biological vulnerability hidden just beneath the skin surface. Human blood flows very close to the surface, carrying vital biological nutrients throughout the entire body. One of those essential nutrients is called folate, which is a vital form of vitamin B9. Ultraviolet radiation acts like a harsh destructive force against delicate folate molecules circulating directly within blood. When a pregnant woman experiences severe folate depletion, the reproductive consequences can be immediate and severe. Folate helps form the neural tube in embryos, which eventually becomes the brain and spinal cord. Without enough of this nutrient in early development, the tiny neural tube may fail to close. This can result in severe developmental infant abnormalities, likely increasing the historical risk of pregnancy loss. Dark skin provided a highly effective natural shield against this specific and invisible harsh environmental pressure. By actively preventing ultraviolet radiation from degrading folate, heavy pigmentation likely increased the chances of successful and healthy pregnancies across early ancient human population. It appears to have been an essential biological condition for the continued survival of the species. This careful biological balance worked perfectly for many tens of thousands of years across the continent. But small nomadic groups of early human hunters began gradually migrating outward away from their homeland. They slowly moved forward through the Middle East, crossed over into the unknown landscapes of Europe, and eventually expanded their territory across Eastern Asia. As these populations drifted further and further north, they encountered a fundamentally different physical natural environment. The distant sun remained exactly the same star, but the geometry of the Earth completely changed. At higher latitudes, sunlight strikes the atmospheric layer at a significantly lower and much shallower angle. It has to pass through a much thicker layer of atmospheric air before reaching the ground. This thick filter heavily absorbs incoming solar radiation. During the long and bitterly cold northern winters, the sky frequently remains heavily overcast for months. The intense radiation that once threatened folate levels largely faded away into the freezing gray skies. But this shift created an entirely new crisis. The human body does not check weather forecasts, and it relies on that same ultraviolet radiation for a crucial and completely non-negotiable physiological process. When a specific type of ultraviolet light radiation, known biologically as UVB, hits the outer skin, it interacts with a compound called 7-dehydrocholesterol. This interaction sparks a complex internal chemical reaction that begins the natural synthesis of vitamin D. The modified molecule must travel through the bloodstream to the liver and then to the kidneys, where it becomes the active usable vitamin D. This active vitamin is essentially a chemical key. Calcium arrives directly from the food you eat, waiting patiently to be absorbed into the bloodstream. But without active vitamin D present to physically unlock the cellular gates, most of the calcium is turned away and passes through unused entirely. Calcium and phosphorus are the primary building blocks that give living bones their rigid structural integrity. When a population receives almost no UVB radiation, human skin simply cannot produce enough vitamin D. Over generations, severe deficiency quietly disrupts skeletal development. In young children, developing bones may frequently fail to properly mineralize and harden during early growth. Clinical observations clearly show that this deficiency can directly lead to childhood rickets, a condition where bones soften and the legs painfully bow outward. In adults, chronic deficiency can trigger a secondary bone condition known in medical literature as osteomalacia. This slowly softens mature bones over many years, making them highly fragile and prone to deformity. Archaeological evidence heavily suggests that in early populations, These specific pelvic bone deformities could significantly complicate the difficult biological process of successful human childbirth. Pelvic narrowing might have increased the natural risk of severe medical complications during intense physical labor. For a dark-skinned individual living in ancient northern Europe 40,000 years in the past, the melanin that once served as a shield had slowly become a very dangerous biological obstacle. As human populations moved further north, they began wearing thick layers of heavy hunted animal hides. You wrap your body in thick winter furs, and you essentially block out whatever weak sunlight was still managing to reach the freezing ground. This behavioral adaptation successfully kept early humans warm, but it further isolated their bare biological skin from the ultraviolet energy highly required for survival. Under these specific environmental and cultural behavioral conditions, natural evolutionary selection slowly reversed its normal direction. When random genetic mutations occasionally produced newborn individuals with slightly less melanin in their outer skin, those specific individuals gained a subtle biological advantage. Lighter skin allowed more weak UVB to penetrate, which safely naturally increased internal vitamin D production. This improved calcium absorption, strengthened developing skeletal bones, and likely slowly contributed to higher reproductive success. Generation after generation, these lighter physical genetic variants slowly began to naturally spread through the population. But this complex biological depigmentation was not rapid. Genetic evidence extracted directly from prehistoric skeletal remains tells a much more complicated and surprising story. Hunter-gatherers living in Europe 10,000 years ago still carried genetic markers for dark skin. So why did these early European human populations remain dark-skinned for so long in darkness? The ancient answer largely comes down to diet. Early nomadic hunter-gatherers regularly consumed fatty fish. These specific foods happened to be naturally rich in highly accessible sources of dietary vitamin D. The dietary intake provided a strong biological buffer, reducing the evolutionary pressure to lose dark melanin. This careful balance completely shattered during one of the most significant transitions in human cultural history. Around 8,000 years ago, human populations began to permanently adopt the practice of stationary agriculture. Early farmers mostly stopped relying on wild game. Instead, they survived almost entirely on cultivated cereals, like planted fields of wheat, barley, and oats. These carbohydrate-heavy crops easily provided enough calories to safely support large and heavily settled communities, but they predictably contained almost absolutely zero vitamins. Early human cells handled complex internal organic chemistry long before anyone accidentally invented the farming plow. Suddenly, the ancient dietary biological buffer was gone. Agricultural populations at freezing and overcast northern latitudes were now completely dependent on their own skin to desperately synthesize this crucial and vital molecule. At the exact moment their dietary intake collapsed, the selection pressure for lighter skin intensified dramatically. Because farming physically supported much larger dense populations, beneficial genetic variations could rapidly spread through villages. Within a relatively short and chaotic evolutionary window, the genetic records show a rapid physical shift toward the much lighter human skin tones observed in high-latitude modern European populations living today. But evolutionary genetics rarely offers a single path. Human skin color is heavily considered a polygenic trait, meaning it involves many interacting gene variations. When modern researchers closely compare the genetic profiles of populations located in northern Europe and Asia, they find something scientifically beautiful and mathematically remarkable. Both distant groups independently evolved much lighter skin. However, they achieved this outcome through different mutations. In evolutionary biology, researchers call this convergent evolution. Similar harsh environmental pressures heavily favored similar traits, but wild nature used slightly different molecular pathways. The sudden appearance of traits extended beyond skin. The genetic variation responsible for striking blue eyes appears to slowly trace back to one individual roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. This isolated mutation simply reduced normal melanin production, specifically located within the iris of the eye. Before this specific genetic variation began to spread, available evidence suggests the entire species had brown eyes for hundreds of thousands of continuous years. Many of the highly visible superficial physical characteristics that people today view as ancient fixed categories are actually quite recent in our biological timeline. For many centuries, human societies have unfortunately built rigid hierarchies based entirely on superficial physical differences. But peeling back the intricate layers of history reveals a much more grounded and practical reality. Skin color operates as an elegant adjustment mechanism. Dark skin represents the original human ancestral baseline, a vital biological adaptation that safely preserved folate and historically protected our earliest human ancient ancestors. Lighter skin is simply a much later variation, favored by selection in cold and overcast regions where the living body desperately needed to absorb scarce ultraviolet light to successfully build rigid bones. We carry the geographic history of humanity directly written into our continuously evolving biological genetic code.